And it's my pleasure to welcome you to the CAISO Working Group call for the Hybrid Resources Initiative. At this time, I'd like to introduce my colleagues in the room with me here today, beginning to my left.
Riddhi Ray, CAISO Infrastructure Contracts.
Abdul Muhammad Ali, Operations Engineering.
Chris Devon, ISO Policy.
Thanks, folks. Our agenda for today's meeting, as you can see, is to discuss the CAISO's metering and telemetry requirements as it relates to this initiative, and we'll begin with Chris setting the context for the discussion, which includes defining the objective and scope of today's meeting, as well as the major issues to note as we move forward. Here's the current schedule for this initiative. We've just published the issue paper, as most know, and thanks, of course, to those who participated in that discussion in late July. And this is our second call. We decided to hold this working group after the last meeting and subsequent comments received. And so you'll see that the next iteration is slated for publication in late September 26th specifically, with an on-site stakeholder meeting to follow shortly thereafter to discuss the revised straw proposal on October 3rd. In addition, the calls and webinars are recorded for stakeholder convenience, allowing those who are unable to attend to listen to the recordings after the meetings. Recordings will be publicly available on the ISO webpage for a limited time following the meetings. And of course, the recordings and any related transcriptions should not be reprinted without ISO's permission. And lastly, of course, if you have any questions, please raise your hand by pressing #2 to enter the queue. And we, of course, ask that you speak your name and the company that you represent. Without further ado, I'll hand it over to Chris.
All right, thanks, Jimmy. Welcome, everyone, to today's working group meeting. I'm going to go over a little bit of background, and we have some of our other technical SMEs will be joining us shortly, and they will walk through the rest of the presentation on some of the other technical discussion as well. So let's start off on the background here. First things first, I want to go over a couple terms and definitions just to kind of set the stage. The first one is obviously hybrid resources. What we have here up on the slide 5 is for hybrid resources, the definition that we included in the issue paper as kind of a proposed definition for hybrid resources. So CAISO refers to hybrid projects or hybrid resources as a combination of multiple technologies or fuel sources that have been combined into a single resource with a single point of interconnection. There is some nuance around this definition, and I think perhaps a bit of confusion that we had during our last stakeholder discussions related to the number of resource IDs associated with hybrid resources. And so I think we want to try to clarify this definition going forward and specify that we really think that true hybrid resources really are only the single resource ID configurations, and that the multiple resource IDs are still a type of a kind of hybrid project, but that they do have a little bit of a difference there when they really have their own, each component has their own resource ID. So we will probably be looking to refine this definition of hybrid resources as we go forward and make that a little bit more clear. But this is kind of the working definition that we have right now. We wanted to point that out at the outset of this discussion, because we will be talking about single resource ID configurations, multiple resource ID configurations during our discussions today. The second item here we wanted to go over, these two are just definitions about the type of metered entities or metering entities that we have in the CAISO tariff, and these are defined in existing definitions in our tariff under Appendix A. We just wanted to point them out here because they are important to kind of some of the discussion we have throughout the day today. The first one being CAISO metered entity, so you'll hear the term CAISO ME or ISO ME or CAISO metered entity thrown around a little bit, and that one is essentially a entity that has elected that CAISO will actually certify and process the revenue quality meter data for the metering purposes. And then the scheduling coordinator metered entity, or SCME, is a bit different from that in that the scheduling coordinator actually does everything on its own and processes and submits the settlement quality meter data to the CAISO. So I wanted to go over those two, kind of explaining the difference, essentially really being that the CAISO metered entity, it essentially has CAISO doing the collection of the revenue quality meter data, and the SCME, or scheduling coordinator metered entity, doing the providing the actual and submitting the settlement quality meter data to CAISO. Both of these options can be used for these hybrid resource projects. We'll talk a little bit more about those as we go through the day today. All right, next up on slide 6 here, I just want to go over some of the objectives for today's discussion. Primarily, we were hoping to provide stakeholders with technical guidance and some opportunity for discussion and education on the current hybrid resource implementation for metering and telemetry requirements and different various configurations that project developers can choose. We briefly talked about these current approaches during the issue paper stakeholder meeting, but we wanted to provide this forum as an additional educational opportunity and discussion opportunity for stakeholders. And I want to note here the sub-bullet on this one that the presentation really it provides the current approaches that are available for hybrid resource projects, meaning we're talking about the provisions in place today primarily with all the diagrams and figures and various configurations that we're going to discuss. So the intent here is to really educate folks on how things work today for our metering and telemetry on these hybrid resource projects, and this was all really established through the ISO's 2016 Hybrid Resources Technical Bulletin, which we also cited to in the issue paper, and that is available on the ISO website for additional background. So with that objective in mind, the secondary objective we want to do today, beyond just educating stakeholders on how things work today, is to use this as an opportunity to identify any areas of possible updates or improvements to the metering and telemetry requirement for hybrid resources. So that idea or that concept is really intended to provide the ISO with some feedback from stakeholders on what things we might be missing, if there's any gaps or barriers to participation related to metering and telemetry, and if there's anything we might need to change or update, they might be able to be flagged a little bit more easily, by having this kind of a more technical discussion and having the opportunity for folks to ask questions of our subject matter experts and really understand how these various configuration options would work. So that's really the other, intent here, as well as, clarifying some of the prior discussions we had during the issue paper stakeholder meeting. If there was anything that was unclear or left unsaid during those discussions, we wanted to try to give an opportunity for folks to participate and have additional discussion on these items. So that's really the objectives for today that I wanted to stress and focus on. But remember, all of the one final thing to stress is that all of the current slides in this proposal, or in this presentation, that have figures and metering diagrams are all the current status quo, basically how things work today. So keep that in mind, and if there's things that we might want to update or change, we can talk about those, and we'll obviously go over those in future iterations of the proposals. Next up, a little bit more background. I wanted to kind of go over just at a high level some of the themes and items that we heard from stakeholder comments on the issue paper, particularly on the metering and telemetry topic itself. So one of the big things we did hear back from stakeholders were we got some statements about the fact that stakeholders believe that metering and telemetry solutions could really eliminate most of the forecasting risk that's associated with hybrid resources. And additionally, these metering and telemetry changes might also be able to help solve some operational issues or operational concerns that the ISO laid out in our issue paper that would be related to hybrid resources. The next item is we heard some requests for additional clarity or clarification of existing metering and telemetry requirements. So I think this workshop is intended to try to help provide some of that additional clarity and clarification, and then I think there may be perhaps some changes that come out of our discussions that will be included in future proposals. And then lastly, I think we heard a few stakeholders mention that there should be certification for the DC meters. We don't currently have that at the ISO. We don't have a certified DC meter provider, but that might be something we need to look into as well. Those are some of the themes and comments we got on the issue paper. And the next stuff I want to go over, again, just a couple more slides here before we get into the technical discussion, just to try to level set and provide some high-level guidance on what we're really going to talk about today and some of the themes in general. One of the things that I want to stress is that we have potentially different requirements for metering and telemetry configurations that depend on how the hybrid resource project is configured. If it has multiple resource IDs, if it has a single resource ID, if it has different modes of charging as far as being AC coupled or DC coupled, those things can all have different impacts to the way that we have to set up the metering and telemetry requirements. So a couple points to go over here for just as like general rules on metering and telemetry. First off, a meter is needed whenever we have a resource ID. So for multiple resource IDs, there has to be multiple meters. And then obviously, depending on where the meter is connected, the meter needs to be compensated for losses to the point of interconnection to the CAISO-controlled grid. So for instance, if the meter is on the low side of the transformer, then it has to be compensated to the point of interconnection for losses. And we'll go over more of those kind of technical details as we go through the rest of the presentation today. The second one here is that we have to have unit output telemetry for single resource ID hybrids that are charging from the on-site generating unit. And that can actually just be the net output of the generating unit, so you could still really only have one telemetry value for that type of a configuration. And then the next one here is that we have note that separate telemetry is needed for single resource ID projects, but if they select the option to charge from the CAISO grid, so that we can actually have visibility into how much the storage component is actually charging from the grid, as well as the other resource component, the telemetry on that one. So those are just a couple high-level points I wanted to touch on. The next slide is a little bit more related to these kind of general metering and telemetry issues, and one of them is related to the limiting schemes that we require for hybrid resources. So a couple points on that. First, if the sum of the resources components generation capability is actually greater than the approved interconnection capability, then the generation output limiting scheme is required to limit that resource's output to its point of interconnection rights. This is similar to how it works for any type of like oversized project today. We see that there are currently oversized projects like VERS, solar farms that might be oversized, and they also have to have limiting equipment to ensure that they don't go above their approved interconnection capability. The next point here is that hybrid resource IDs under single resource ID configuration that elects to charge the storage component from the on-site generating unit means that they can't have any charging from the grid. In other words, no negative generation can occur, and therefore a limiting scheme is also required to prevent those kind of facilities from actually charging from the grid, so that no negative generation to the grid to charge that resource. So with that, I'm going to pause and open it up for questions from stakeholders. And I also want to note that a couple of our other folks from the team are here to take over.
Yeah, hi, this is Susan Schneider from Phoenix Consulting. Can you hear me?
Yes, Susan, go ahead.
Okay, I had just a clarifying question, and it may be obvious, but belaboring the obvious, but let me ask anyway. It's on slide 8. So if you are charging from the grid, and I think I believe there's some small amount of grid charging that's allowed, even if people are going for the ITC. So you may get a lot of that. They have to have separate telemetry, but they still only need 1 meter for the single resource ID, right?
Generally, I think that would be a fair statement. I think that we're discussing if we need to have additional meters for certain things, such as RPS reporting and such. So, but generally, yes, under the current provisions, you can just have a single meter, but they do need to have separate telemetry. So there's that.
Okay, and you're talking today about what is currently in place, and that's your. I mean, currently you can't have 1 meter even with separate telemetry.
That's right. That's correct.
Okay. All right. And then I had a question about on slide 9 on the limiting, the second bullet on the limiting schemes. So if there is the reason why you need this limiting if they elect to charge only from the on-site unit, it seems like if there is negative generation, there would be an economic consequence. But basically because you wouldn't necessarily have, because if you thought they were only going to charge from on-site generation, you wouldn't have set it up with a separate telemetry for the storage, or you wouldn't have necessarily done that, and that's why you have to make sure that doesn't happen?
Yeah, that's right. Going back to the, the prior slide, the item that you were just discussing again, separate telemetry is needed for different, options of charging from the CAISO grid. So, yeah, that's definitely one of the drivers there of why we need this limiting scheme, because we don't have telemetry to see what's actually going on with a battery that is, or a storage unit that is, not designated as charging from the grid.
Okay. Is there any other reason why you need this scheme? You said it's part of the reason or part of the driver. I was wondering if there's anything else, any other reason why you would need this limitation.
I'm personally not aware of another reason for that. I think that's really our primary concern.
Okay, great. That's all the questions I had. Thank you.
All right, great. Well, I think I'm going to introduce our other couple members. We have Mike Turner and Priyanka Namburi here as well to go over the rest of the technical discussion. I'm going to turn it over to them.
This is Priyanka Namburi. I'm Lead Energy Data Acquisition Specialist at ISO, and we will be going over various scenarios and talking in detail about metering and telemetry for the hybrid configurations. So the hybrid resources, they can be connected at the transmission level, at the ISO grid control level, or at the sub-transmission or distribution level. And we have some diagrams in the next slides to talk about each configuration level and what are the metering requirements for depending on where the resource is connected to the ISO grid. Moving on to the next slide. In this scenario, if you look at the drawing, the meter is connected on the high side of the transformer, and this resource is connected directly to the ISO control grid. ISO requirement is to have the meters on the high side of the transformers but we have some scenarios where the resources, if there are multiple resources and they share the transformer, then we do allow low-side metering, but it is, and after ISO review, we approve low-side metering, but high-side metering is the ISO requirement. So in this case, where there is an on-site generator and a storage unit, and the resource is participating as a single resource ID, then there is a high-side meter that calculates the net output. Then for any additional metering purposes, the resource may require an additional meter on the battery to measure the battery charging and discharging. In the second scenario, where the resource is connected to the distribution level grid, the meter is again installed on the high side of the transformer, and an additional meter may be required to measure the battery charging or discharging. But since the meter is, the resource itself is at the distribution connection, the meter needs to be compensated to the ISO point of interconnection. The next scenario is for the low-side metering, where there are separate meters for the on-site generator and also for the storage unit. Both the meters are connected at the low side, and in this case, both the meters have to be compensated for the transformer losses. Since the resource is connected to the grid, only transformer losses are required to be programmed in these two meters. In the last scenario, where the resource is connected at the distribution level, and the meters are at the low side of the transformer, both the meters have to be compensated for the transformer and also for the transmission line losses. Before we move on to the AC and DC connections, do you have any questions related to these four scenarios? Okay. Now let's talk about a single resource ID, and if the single resource ID is charging from the on-site unit. So for the single resource ID, which charges from the on-site generating unit, ISO would need only the output of the combined facility, the net output of the combined facility. So as we have seen in the previous drawings, only 1 meter is required at the high side of the transformer for ISO settlement purposes. But if there is any other need to measure the battery charging and discharging, then additional meters may be required. So under the single resource ID, ISO will send the dispatch instructions to the single resource. It will not send the dispatch instructions for the individual units, either for generation, charging, or for discharging. And the settlement is also at the point of delivery, and the meter have to be adjusted to the losses for the CAISO control grid, and the meters have to be programmed for 5-minute intervals. And again, in the scenario where it is a single resource ID, but the charging is done from the grid, not from the on-site facility, in that case, this combined hybrid resource, both the on-site generating facility and the storage unit, both of them have to be metered and telemetered separately. And ISO will send the dispatch instructions to the single resource ID. These individual components, they are not subject to the individual dispatch instructions from ISO for generation, charging, and discharging. And it is the responsibility of the resource owner and their scheduling coordinator to manage the overall resource output to deliver to ISO awards. And since it is a single resource ID, the settlement will be at the point of delivery for the combined output of both the resources at the CAISO grid level, programmed at 5-minute intervals. Looks like there's a question.
Thanks, Priyanka.
Yes,
looks like we have a question in the queue, operator.
Yes, this is Susan Schneider again from Phoenix Consulting. I apologize. I had my hand up for the questions on the diagrams, and so I apologize for making you go back there. I'm not sure what happened there. So could we go back to slide 12? I'm so sorry to do that. But I just had a conversation with the earlier speaker about the fact that if you had if you had a generator and you had storage, and the storage was charging only from the on-site generation, that you had to have separate telemetry, but you only had to have one meter. And now this diagram seems to be, again, I apologize if I'm not understanding this, but this diagram seems to say the opposite. It seems to say that you have to have a separate meter, even if it's only one resource ID, you have to have a separate meter for the storage. So I think, and now maybe I'm getting confused with the 1 versus 2 resource ID on the diagram because they're not specific, but this seems to be contrary to the earlier discussion we had about that.
So if you see the slide, there is a second bullet item on the left side. It says additional meter may be required. So under the single resource ID, we need only 1 meter for the net output. But if there is any, what Chris has also mentioned earlier, for RPS or WREGIS reporting purposes, we may need an additional meter. And we'll talk about that in detail in the upcoming slides. So if there is only for the settlement purposes, ISO settlement purposes, only 1 meter is enough. But if the resource would like to participate in WREGIS or have to do any other type of configuration, in those cases, we may require additional metering.
Okay, so that's I think part of the confusion you're having is that sometimes internally the slides don't match. So the earlier one, so when if you could clarify what is required by ISO rules and what is required by other people's rules, I think that would be helpful. Also, it's hard to imagine that somebody would not want RPS reporting, so that that may be a moot point. But okay, so all of these things where you have all these diagrams where you have the separate meter on the storage. First of all, are these all for single resource IDs, or are these for multiple resource IDs? Are all the 4 diagrams? What are they assuming?
These are in general, most of them are for the single resource IDs. We have more slides upcoming where we talk in detail about what is the metering requirements for single resource ID and for the multiple resource IDs.
Okay, so if you, and again, I'm trying to connect this to the earlier discussion. In these 4 diagrams where you have the meter on the storage unit, and not just 1 meter for the whole facility, this is only for RPS reporting purposes, or it's for ISO, or the ISO requires it?
So the slide 12, the additional meter on the storage unit is for the RPS reporting purposes, and most of the resources prefer ISO to be their QRE coordinator. They want ISO to report to WREGIS. So in that case, this additional meter needs to be an ISO meter. So in that, when the resource wants ISO to be their QRE coordinator, then it becomes an ISO requirement to have an additional meter. But if the entity prefers ISO not to be their QRE coordinator, then it is not an ISO requirement to install the meter. They can use any other methodology to come up with the calculation without a meter or without an ISO meter and report to WREGIS.
Okay. All right. And then is there, in this diagram, let's just take them one at a time then. In this diagram where you have the meter, you don't have any lossless compensation to the POI. Are you assuming the meter is approximately at the POI there?
Correct. So because the ISO control grid, it is at the POI. That's the assumption in this drawing.
Okay. Okay, so let's go to slide 13, okay, where you've got basically it's basically the same diagram as for at slide 12, except you're just assuming now that because that the meter is at the POI here, but that you have to compensate also on the distribution side for losses, right?
Correct. In this drawing, the resource is connected at the distribution level.
Okay, and so the only difference between this diagram and the slide 12 diagram is that because this is a distribution level, you need to put in that additional loss compensation.
Correct, yes.
Is that right? Okay, okay. So let's go to slide 14. Okay, so now, are you assuming 1 resource ID here or 2?
It can be both.
Okay, so let's talk about 1 resource.
Okay.
I'm sorry?
Go ahead.
Okay. Okay. So here you have 1 meter on each side, even though it's one. Let's assume we're talking about one resource ID since it applies in either case. So what is the reason for requiring 2 separate meters here? Is it only for the RPS report? I mean, I'm trying to figure out why you would need 2 separate meters here. Is it to divide the transformer losses properly, or how would you? What is the reason for that?
So that's why I said it is for both single resource ID or for the multiple resource IDs. If it is for the multiple resource IDs, then we need 1 meter on each resource. So
right,
that's why there is a meter on the on-site. Yeah. If it is a single resource ID, then no, they don't have to meter it separately. They can have 1 meter right below the transformer to measure the output, and the additional meter is for the RPS reporting.
Okay. See, that's what, again, these are sort of mixing things together, and it makes it a little hard to understand. So that's the only reason this diagram actually does assume 2 resource IDs. But if you had the 1, then you could just have the 1 meter, and that would be all you would need, except for the possible exception of that RPS reporting issue that you discussed, right?
Yeah.
Okay. Okay. So let's go now to slide 15. This is very helpful, by the way, and I appreciate your patience here. And so slide 15 is basically the slide on slide 14, except that because you have a distribution-connected resource, now you have to compensate for the transmission losses as well. Is that right?
Correct. Yes.
Okay, so if this was a single resource ID, same as what we talked about before, you wouldn't necessarily need a meter on each side. You could use just 1 meter on that low side of the transformer, right?
Right.
Okay, great. Okay, those are my questions. Thank you very much. I really appreciate the clarification.
Okay. I think we have one more person who has questions.
Hi, this is Sergio from CAISO. I have a question about the single resource ID. If you could go to slide 17, I believe. Yes, so I have a question. Let's imagine that we have a resource that is solar plus storage. As I understand it, it would be scheduled by the CAISO in the day ahead, et cetera, and it would be exempt from having any fines if its output deviates from what was considered by a CAISO. Now, if you're under a single resource ID with storage, is it still considered a variable resource, or does it need to meet the scheduled outputs?
I'm sorry, your line is not so clear. Can you repeat the question?
Yes, can you hear me now?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, so let's imagine that we have a resource that is solar plus storage. As I understand it now, solar being scheduled for the day-ahead deliveries of energy, it's not subject to deliver exactly what is expected of it as a resource. Now, when you add it to storage, does it become a dispatchable resource and now it's subject to fines if it's not delivering as scheduled?
This is Chris Devin. So I think I understand your question. I'm going to restate it again. So your statement here on the single resource ID with solar component, that's obviously a VER that gets EIR, PIR treatment, can operate and can actually deviate from its day-ahead awards and doesn't have financial consequence because of the treatment that resource enjoys today. If you add a storage component and then this resource becomes a single resource ID hybrid, it would be treated like a dispatchable resource and it would no longer receive that treatment where it can essentially deviate from its day ahead and only do up to what it's actually forecasted to be able to do and have that upper economic limit in the market be updated on a 5-minute basis. So that would no longer happen. So we have been kind of pointing that out to developers that under the current rules, it may not be as advantageous to go under the single resource ID because of some of these potential financial consequences related to that. However, this is an area which we are exploring if there's some way that we can potentially propose a different treatment perhaps going forward in the future as part of this proposal where we may be able to allow for that type of resource to actually update their bids more frequently or provide an upper economic limit adjustment based off of their like self-supplied forecast or something like that where we can allow for a single resource ID to perhaps enjoy some of the benefits of that kind of a treatment as opposed to the current status quo. So I'll stop there.
Yeah, thank you. That's a very good interpretation of my question. I'm sorry if I wasn't as eloquent as you were. I have another question really quickly. So let's imagine that we have, and I'm just throwing numbers out there. We have a 100 megawatt solar farm, and we have 100 megawatts of 4-hour lithium-ion batteries. So what would be the upper limit if it's charging only with the solar so as to fulfill ITC and single resource ID requirements? What would be the upper limit of output for you? Would it be the 200? Because clearly it can't exceed the 200 if it's charging solely from the solar. Or would it be an additive 400 in the two limit?
I would say in your case, the upper limit should be only 100 because if the battery is completely charged, then you can give only maximum of 100 megawatts after the sunset hours, and you're participating as a single resource ID.
And I would just add to that, this is Chris again, I would just add that, it really, the upper amount that you can actually inject at any given time is really truly limited by whatever your point of interconnection rights actually are. So if you have requested in the interconnection process that you want 200 megawatts or 400 megawatts for this kind of project, whatever you actually, establish through the interconnection process as your point of interconnection injection rights would be the upper limit that you can ever put onto the grid at any given time. And that is why we require like controls, tripping type of control schemes for avoiding going above that amount of energy being injected given instantaneous time frame.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thanks for the question.
Do we have any more questions? Okay. Moving on to slide number 18. For the 2 or more resource IDs with both the charging options. So when there are 2 or more resources participating as under different resource IDs for a combined generating facility, then each of those units has to be metered and telemetered separately. And CAISO will send separate dispatch instructions to each resource ID. For the settlement purposes, both the projects have to be metered at the point of delivery for each resource ID. And each individual unit have to be compensated for the losses and metered at 5-minute intervals. Now let's talk about the WREGIS RPS reporting metering. So when there are 2 or more resource IDs that are charging from the on-site generating unit, and we talked about it a little bit earlier, that it would require additional metering for the WREGIS reporting purposes. So today's requirement, under today's ISO guidelines, additional metering is not required, but as part of this initiative, with this numerous questions we are receiving from the stakeholders on how we can do WREGIS RPS reporting, we are exploring the options for making more modifications, and that's why we mentioned that we may need additional meters to measure the output coming from the solar that is used for charging of the battery. So that's the reason we are saying we need additional meters. So any questions on REGIS reporting? Okay, we have a question.
Hi, Susan Schneider, Venus Consulting again. I did have one more question on slide 17. I'm sorry, I was in the queue and didn't get called on. So again, I sort of following, do you mind going to slide 17? And then I do have a question on the slide where we were as well. On 17? I'm looking at 13. Got it, perfect. Okay, thank you. So now again, we're back to the situation here. We have a single resource ID, and if you're charging from the grid, so we know that there's got to be two sets of telemetry for the two. But I thought, except for the RPS reporting issue, that as far as ISO is concerned, you could do this with 1 meter, but just 2 separate telemetry feeds. So that's what I think we talked about before. But here it says you have to actually have 2 separate meters, I think is what this says, right?
Yeah. Again, we're talking about REGIS reporting here. The separate meters may be required for the REGIS reporting purposes.
Okay, so as far as the ISO is concerned, you still, again, just need 1 meter here, and it's only the RPS reporting that might be driving the second meter.
Correct, yes.
Okay, thank you. That's very helpful. Now let's go to slide 19 where you were. And I noticed, one of the comments that was put in that I thought was interesting was I think the way that you're looking at the RPS reporting, and I don't want to steal I don't think there's anything else here in the presentation. So for RPS reporting, if you have, say, a solar generator and you have a storage facility that's not connected to it, it's some other place on the grid, or let's say downstream or something like that, and the solar generation is producing whatever it's producing, and then some of that may physically go into, say, the storage facility if the storage is charging at the same time, and then be discharged back to the grid. But the solar facility gets full credit for the REGIS as far as REGIS goes for the RPS reporting, because that's based on the meter for the solar project. And now somehow when you put the two together in a hybrid situation, whether it's 1 resource ID or 2, I think that at least the implication in the issue paper was that you're going to subtract the round trip losses through the storage, because I'm assuming because that energy doesn't really hit the grid. But just because they happen to be located in the same place and using the same interconnection facilities, I'm wondering if that's what the logic is of subtracting out those. I understand the logic of subtracting out the long round-trip losses generally, but if they happen to be 2 completely separate facilities, you don't do that. You only would do that, I think, based on the issue paper if they were located on the same, in this hybrid type of configuration. So can you discuss that for just a minute, or is that sort of beyond what you're trying to talk about today?
So, yeah, like I mentioned, this is something we are exploring based on some of the upcoming projects we have in the pipeline and the discussions we are having with the metering firms. So some of the upcoming projects, they are having a discussion with us, and they are saying that even if there are 2 separate resource IDs, if they're participating under 2 separate resource IDs, they are charging the battery from the solar unit. So that's why they want the credit for the REGIS RPS purposes. So that is the reason we are saying that then we need to measure the output that is coming from the solar resource and that is going into the battery. That is the reason we are saying we need additional meters. But
okay.
If they're not connected, not electrically connected at all, then they cannot prove that the battery is charging from the solar resource. It's only when they are electrically connected, then if they put additional meters, they can prove that the battery is charged by the renewable energy and is eligible for the REGIS RPS accounting.
Right. No, I guess I understand that, and maybe I wasn't asking this clearly, but I thought that the ISO proposal, or it seemed like your interpretation of the CEC rules, which don't really address this explicitly, but your interpretation was that you would take the solar output and you would subtract out the round-trip losses through the, if the solar is injecting into the storage. I understand you have a meter there, that you would take the solar output and you would subtract the round-trip losses through the storage, and then and that would end up being the RPS credit reporting, the rec reporting. So is that not right? Is that, I mean, that's what I thought you were doing with that, well, anyway, that was the implication from the issue paper.
Right. Again, it depends on the metering configuration. So the solar may not always give the power to charge the battery. In most cases, it will give power to the grid. So in that case, whatever is the total solar output will be used for the solar REGIS credits. But when it is using only to charge the battery, which could be the percentage of a day, that energy is going into battery, and then when the battery exports it, the clean energy is coming back to the grid. So this additional meter, whenever it measures that the solar output is coming to the battery, then this meter will measure that, and we will, our proposal, our discussions we are having is that we can use this meter for battery REGIS reporting.
Okay, so let me be clear on my question. I'm referring to the situation where the solar, not where the solar is going, output goes directly to the grid, but in the cases where the solar output is going into the storage, and you are, and presumably maybe you have some kind of meter to do that, to measure that. But my understanding of the RPS reporting here is that the ISO would be subtracting out the round trip losses as it goes into the storage, comes out of the storage, and there's less that comes out than goes in, and those are the round trip losses. And so my understanding is that the ISO would be subtracting out the round-trip losses from the solar output that went into the storage in order to do the RPS reporting. Is that, am I understanding that correctly?
That could be possible in some of the configurations, but not all of them. So if one of the other discussions we had, then that's where we ended up deciding that, yeah, in some cases, they may need additional meters to measure that. Yeah,
I'm not talking about the meters. I'm assuming, let's assume the meter's there, and you are measuring it, okay? And you're measuring, there's as many meters in my question as you need to get this right, okay? So you have take the solar, you put it in the storage, and then it comes out of the storage into the grid. Okay. My understanding is that you would not be taking the output of the solar and using that for RPS reporting, but that you would actually be subtracting out the round trip losses from the fact that it travels through the storage before it gets to the grid. And put as many meters in that discussion as you need to get that to work. But am I understanding that properly?
I think we have not reached any conclusion on this. We are still having discussions on how.
Okay.
Yeah.
And
that's part of the solution.
Let me jump in and clarify as well, Susan. I think we've been trying to understand what kind of metering configurations we would need to include, which is, I think, driving some of your questions earlier, regarding this issue as well. And I think we're trying to understand what kind of metering setups we need to have, so that we can actually get that information without having to do that kind of calculation, where we actually just have the correct value that's going into the battery storage, and then what's coming out of the battery storage and onto the grid, and how much is coming off of the solar unit, so that way accurately report that RPS amount, which does take into account that conversion loss factor that you're discussing. And I think this is a good question, and this is the kind of thing we were hoping to kind of discuss further here during the meeting today, to try to surface what issues, if any, do we really need to address regarding this REGIS RPS reporting, and maybe we need to make that requirement rather than it being just an ISO need to help us do our QRE REGIS reporting, but actually just to incorporate that requirement when we have any of these type of resources. That might be part of our next proposal, so that way we can ensure that we have the right information and we're not doing a one-off calculation on various different projects.
Okay, I'm not asking the question because I care about how many meters are in this discussion. I'm asking the question because it sounds like whether you're doing it because you're just measuring what comes out of the storage by itself versus what goes in, or you're going to do a calculation, is the concept, okay, forget about how many meters you need to do it. Okay, it's 20 meters, I don't care. But is the concept that you are going to subtract the round-trip losses in what you report for RPS purposes?
I believe that is the current way that the CEC has described it needs to be done in their RPS compliance guidebook. which we cited to in our issue paper. We will ensure
so now that's what I want to discuss.
Proposal. Go ahead.
Okay, thank you. That was what I was trying to get at, and I apologize if I just wasn't clear in the question. So, if the two facilities, the solar and the storage, are in this hybrid configuration, whether it's let's call it two resource IDs, then you're going to subtract out the round-trip losses. Now, let's look at a situation where a solar and a storage facility are not in a hybrid configuration. Let's say they're even going into the same substation or a nearby one. Okay. So the solar then would get full credit for all of its RPS, or all of its energy produced going into that substation or, that area. And you would not be subtracting from that the fact that some other storage facility somewhere else might have actually sucked up that energy before it actually went to any consumers, which is what RPS is a percentage of retail sales. So you wouldn't be subtracting anything out from that solar if the storage facility just happened to be some other place, maybe next door, but separate and not in a hybrid configuration. The solar would have gotten full credit for the RPS for all of its production, despite the fact that maybe some of that might have gone to a storage facility somewhere nearby even. So I guess I would like you, it sounds like you haven't quite gotten there yet, but it was in at least one set of the comments, and I hope you'll address the equity of that situation in the next proposal version. Is that clear?
Well, Susan, I think that's a fair question to ask, but I think our initial position on that would be that those solar resources that are separate, that don't have a on-site charging generation, we don't know where those electrons are flowing to, where that energy is going to.
Yes.
And I don't think that we're intending to try to track that or create some additional type of provisions that would somehow adjust for those losses, simply because of the fact that they have chosen to do that type of a project in the manner that they've developed it. So I think if you have a proposal for how we should properly do that, we'd be happy to consider it. But we don't have any plans to propose a new approach to somehow adjust for conversion losses for individual projects. That's not part of the scope.
I'm not suggesting that. Okay, I'm not suggesting that. I'm suggesting that the fact that you are going to make this adjustment just because they're in a hybrid situation is unfair compared to the situation where, no, I'm not suggesting you go try and figure out, trace the green and the red electrons and where they go and all that. That's obviously impossible.
I understand. So, I think we understand your viewpoint on that, Susan. I think it's a fair point that you're making. I think we would tend to disagree with the fact that you're stating that it's unfair. I think in this case we are sure that there is a conversion loss for the storage component, and that's the reason why we would be trying to report it to RPS in that manner. So I think that might just be a difference of opinion. We'll have to talk through it some more, and happy to continue these discussions going forward.
And that's all I was asking. If you could give that some thought and address that in the next proposal version, we don't have to take any more time today to do that. I'm sorry, I interrupted somebody else there, I heard.
Susan, this is Mike Turner. Let me see if this makes sense. If you have a hybrid facility that is not charging from the grid and there's a limiting scheme there, then does it make sense only having 1 meter to measure the net output of whatever that hybrid resource puts onto the grid could be used for RPS reporting purposes? So that, in other words, the solar that goes out to the grid gets credit, the solar that goes into the battery and goes out later gets credit, but only the credit notwithstanding the losses.
Understood. My example had 2 resource IDs, but yes, I understand what you're saying, and I agree that that's the only way you could do it because you don't have any meters to measure anything else.
Right. Now, if you have a resource, single resource ID, that also is allowed to charge from the grid, we have no way of telling what kind of electrons are coming in off the grid into that battery. So we could measure what goes out from the solar and through a meter measure what goes from the solar to the battery that ultimately goes back out to the grid. And I think that's a case where we'd need 2 meters. Do you agree?
Yes.
Okay.
Well, not necessarily,
If
but
you
yes.
have-
For purposes of this discussion, yes, but I don't see why you would actually need that if you treated the solar the same as if they were two separate facilities. But if it's a single resource ID, I guess you probably would need that other meter.
Because I think in that second scenario that the solar, we would be giving them credit for what goes out onto the grid as well as what can be readily identifiable as going from the solar into the battery and then out to the grid. But if there's something coming in off the grid into the battery, we can't tell whether that's reasonable to report for RPS.
Yes. Yes, I agree. You would need to subtract out whatever comes off the grid. I do see how you would have to do that because you don't know where that is. So that makes sense.
Okay. Now, if you have two separate resource IDs, again, full credit for the solar going out. For the battery, it is what it is, and the purpose of the meter on that would be just for settlement purposes, not for any RPS because you can't tell what's going into the battery.
My hypothetical was if the solar facility was by itself, no matter what happens to it after it gets into the grid, it may not ever get to consumers until it goes through some storage somewhere, but you don't really know that, and I think we're all in agreement on that. So if the solar was by itself, it would go into the grid and you would get full credit for everything, okay? So just because the solar, some of it happens to go through a battery before it gets to the grid, and I agree that not all of it gets to the grid, I really do, and not all of it, because not all of it gets to the grid, not all of it gets to consumers, and so there's some issues with RPS reporting, but they're not any worse than any issues if the solar was totally by itself and then the energy was sucked in by some storage somewhere else. It's not a different issue. I think it's a substantive issue and an interesting one, but to treat the solar separate just because it's different from standalone solar just because it happens to have storage nearby and you know that some of that's going in there, it's a little bit different from the way it would get full credit if it was totally separate in two different places, two different sites. So that's all I'm asking is there is I think an equity question and a substantive question here about whether you are dinging it for round-trip losses just because you happen to know that they exist, whereas otherwise they could still exist, but you just don't know it, so you ignore that situation. So I think we understand. Go ahead. Sorry.
Yeah, no, I think we're on the same page there, and the key for this discussion, and ultimately what comes out in the proposal, is that we've got the correct metering schemes for how people want to operate the resource so that we can properly report for RPS purposes what we know for a fact is solar output or wind output.
Right. Okay. Anyway, I think we're. I apologize for belaboring you, but I think we are understanding each other, and I'm just going to ask you to think about those two different situations, and now how what you're proposing is fair for people in those two different projects in this situation. So I'm looking forward to seeing how you treat this in the next proposal.
Thanks so much, Susan. I do believe we have another caller who's been patiently waiting in the queue.
Thank you.
Yeah, hi, thanks. This is Dave Carter from the Schatz Energy Research Center. I had a question on slide 17. And it had to do with the telemetry requirements for single resource IDs, where each resource would be required to have separate metering and telemetry. Talking specifically about the telemetry, so we have a DC coupled solar storage system that we're attempting to bring online as a hybrid resource to operate in CAISO markets. And so for this, we would have a single resource ID, we're thinking, and the telemetry would really just be to the battery because that's the grid-forming inverter. It's the only grid-facing inverter that we have. where our DC, our PV is on the DC bus of the battery, so there's no controllability for the PV other than just through the battery itself. So for that case, we would just have telemetry to the battery. So I just wanted to check. It wouldn't be really meaningful to try to separately telemeter the PV. So I just wanted to put that out there and hear your response.
So today's requirements, we would require only the net output, which will be, as you mentioned, the battery output. But through this initiative, we are exploring whether ISO needs any additional telemetry data from this combined hybrid resource, which could be the met station data for the PV and any other additional points we may need from the battery. But under today's requirement, I think Chris already mentioned this earlier in the presentation, under today's requirements, we would need only single telemetry for your resource, but we are exploring, especially having discussions with our short-term forecasting team for the PV forecasting purposes if we need any weather data from the.
Okay. Yeah, so we can certainly provide meter data from the PV side, and if that's desired. It's just that there's no controllability on the PV side. And one more question. Yeah. Could we go to slide 10, please?
Yeah, before that, I would like to add more clarification. So we wouldn't need, under the single resource ID, we wouldn't need the megawatts from the PV output because it's the net output we need from the single resource ID. The additional telemetry points will be related to the weather data, the meteorological station data, not the meter data. So under the single resource ID, so in your case, particularly in your, yeah, you're not required to put another meter on the PV in your case, specifically in your case. But through this initiative, we are exploring if we need weather data from the sites like yours.
I see. So we will. That's good to know because we currently don't have those points in our plan that we would be able to serve up to you. So we'll have to go back and look at that to have those available in case you do decide you want them.
And this is Chris. I just want to jump in as well and mention that we're still considering if that needs to be an actual interconnection requirement to provide that MET station data to allow us to have a forecastability on some of the VER components of these single resource ID hybrids. Another option we're also considering is the potential for the resource owner, the resource SC, to provide their own forecast for the overall resource itself. And we think that might be a potential solution as well. So more to come on that, I think, for folks that are in their current design and development of their projects. It's still, I don't want to say for sure we're going to have it one way or another, but we're considering both those kind of options.
Okay, thank you. And then on slide 10, I had a quick question on just to confirm, because we don't need the ITC because it's a public project, so and we intend to charge from the grid. As our main charging is going to be, of course, through the DC coupled PV, but we at this point we're targeting participation in the ancillary services market. That could change, but at this point that's our plan, and so we would in that market we would be charging from the grid as well. And I just want to confirm, because the way the bullet was worded here, so no negative generation can occur. So I just wanted to clarify that we wouldn't be precluded from charging from the grid.
Right, that's only the limiting scheme needs to be in place only when the resource elects to charge only from the on-site generating unit. In your case, you mentioned that it will be charging also from the grid. So in your case, yes, you're charging both from PV and from the grid. You don't need to have this limiting scheme in place. But some resources who do not want to charge from the grid at all, they need to have a limiting scheme in place so that there is no negative energy.
Okay, thank you for that clarification. That's all I had.
Do we have any more questions?
At this time, we don't have any more questions, but if anyone wants to ask a question, please press #2 on your telephone keypad. Once again, please press #2 on your telephone keypad if you wish to ask a question. We just got a question. Caller, please go ahead.
Hi, this is Carrie Bentley from the Western Power Trading Forum. I was wondering, in the response to the last caller, I got a little confused because it sounded like under that situation, it would be 2 resource IDs and not 1. So I'm wondering if the slides in here are saying you're only going to do 1 resource ID, or whether it's still up to, or you're proposing 2 different schemes, and then it's up to the scheduling coordinator to decide which works best for them, 1 resource ID or 2.
It is up to the resource owner to decide whether they want to participate under a single resource ID or multiple resource IDs. That is why we are mentioning what are the requirements, whether it is a single resource ID or multiple. The caller mentioned that in his case it is a single resource ID. That's why we said they need a single meter and single telemetry. But we are exploring options for forecasting purposes that additional telemetry points may be required. But if it is multiple resource IDs, then definitely separate telemetry is required.
Is required. Okay, that makes sense to me. I'm wondering if at some point this information can be maybe gathered in a way that says that I know you guys don't like to recommend configurations, but maybe some examples to walk through it from end to end. Because it's getting a little confusing on here's the situation, here's all your different options, when it seems like maybe some options are better suited for different resource configurations than others. But I appreciate all the information here. Thank you.
So, Carrie, this is Chris, and I think one of the things that we've kind of been thinking about doing as far as along those lines that you're talking about is in our next proposal is to put out a description of like kind of the business cases or the business drivers that we believe some of these project developers might be looking at and might be causing them to try to, decide to do these type of hybrid resource projects, and then more specifically, perhaps what might really be driving them to choose one of the different configurations. And I think we're still trying to grasp some of that, and I think that might be driving a bit of the confusion on some of these discussions. So I just want to commit that we will be trying to kind of lay that out in our next proposal, what the ISO's understanding is, try to get some feedback from stakeholders on, is that accurate? Is that what people really think that their business cases really are? For instance, things like, is it going to be to try to smooth their output over the day and avoid forecast error? Is it going to be to really arbitrage energy prices? Is it going to be to provide ancillary services and get RA value and things like that? So we want to try to put some of those, business case, just general business cases out there, explain what we think that they would be needed for, and then also try to tie that to some of these different configurations and what it really means and how we would actually think that what ones of these they might want to choose, I think, kind of to your point. So hopefully we can get there. I think that's something that we're thinking about, and we do need to get some more feedback from stakeholders on it. So I think that one will probably take a couple iterations to really, get a good laid out description of what the different options are and what folks should really think about choosing. Because you are right, too. We can't really say what folks should do, but I think we can kind of provide some guidance, and I think we'll look to do that in the upcoming proposals.
Thanks, Chris. That's great. That's exactly what I was looking for, so I really appreciate that.
Thanks, And operator, I don't believe we have any more in the queue. Is that correct?
We don't have any more questions.
Okay, moving on. The next topic we are about to discuss are metering and telemetry configurations for the AC and DC. So there are some important differences for the requirements when these hybrid resources are under AC or DC configurations, but our general requirement of separate metering and telemetry for the separate resource IDs, that stays the same. So in the upcoming slides, we'll discuss about some of these configurations. So in this case, where there is a storage component that is connected to the DC side, and then there's an inverter, but the meter is located on the AC side for the battery and also for the solar panels. Since the meters are at the AC side, this configuration, they can participate both as scheduling coordinator metered entity and ISO metered entity. Chris earlier talked about these two configurations. In the scheduling coordinator metered entity, the scheduling coordinators are required to collect the data and submit the data. Under ISO metered entity, ISO will collect the data, and the resource owner is required to install ISO meters, so ISO can collect the data, process, and submit that data. So in this option, both of these options are available. A resource owner has the choice to select between one of those two options. The next scenario where the meter is connected on the AC under a single resource ID, again, because it is the meter is connected on the AC side, this option also has both scheduling coordinator metered entity and ISO metered entity. It is the AC connection under the single resource ID. Next option is where the meters are connected at the DC side, where under the separate resource IDs, one for the storage unit and one for the batteries, one for the PV, and under separate resource IDs where there are meters that are on the DC side. Since we don't have any ISO approved DC metering, in this case, the only option the resource owner has is to elect the scheduling coordinator metered entity, and the scheduling coordinator, under the scheduling coordinator metered entity, the metering requirements is to have a transducer that meets either their LRA accuracy requirements, local regulatory authority accuracy requirements, and in the absence of that, it's the ISO requirements. So the meter have to meet ISO requirements in the absence of local regulatory authority requirements. And since this option is only available for the scheduling coordinator metered entities, scheduling coordinator has to collect the meter data, process the meter data, and submit that meter data to the ISO. The inverter, transformer, and line losses must also be calculated and compensated in this case. The next option is for DC metering under single resource ID, and when the battery is charging from the solar, since it is the DC connection metering, even this option, only SCME is available because the total, these multiple units are participating under a single resource ID, even though they have an AC meter for the solar panels, but there is the DC component and the meters are at the DC side. So together this unit has to submit single metered value, and they can participate in this way using the scheduling coordinator meter entity option. Do we have any questions in the queue?
We don't have any. We just got a question. Caller, please go ahead.
Hi, this is Luke Hansen from 8 Minute Solar Energy. Could you review again what you mean by only the schedule coordinator metering option available here? I I think I didn't quite catch the nuance of what you're referring to.
Right. So ISO don't, to participate as an ISO metered entity, you are required to install an ISO approved meter. ISO does not have any approved DC meters. We are looking forward to certify one, but so far we don't have any on our list. So if the customer wants to install the meter on the DC side, then since there are no ISO meters, the only option is to participate as a scheduling coordinator metered entity. Under the scheduling coordinator metered entity, the entity is not required to install ISO approved meters. Does it answer your question?
What are the other implications of that? That this as a scheduled coordinator metered entity, there's limited participation in certain services or other,
there are no implications at all. No, it is the two different types of participation, and in both the choices, ISO will do the settlements. The only difference is who is submitting the data to ISO settlements. Under ISO ME, ISO metering department, we will collect the meter data, we will process the meter data, and we will submit the data to ISO settlements. Under the scheduling coordinator meter entity, your scheduling coordinator will collect the meter data, they will process the data, and they are required to submit the data to ISO settlements. But there won't be any implications on either side.
Are there...
To become an ISO meter, you are required to follow ISO requirements that are mentioned in ISO tariff and ISO metering DPM, where you are required to install an ISO meter, and that meter has to be inspected by ISO authorized inspector. Whereas under scheduling coordinated meter entity, you are not required to install an ISO approved meter.
Are there performance requirements from the ISO for that meter, which is provided by and monitored by the scheduling coordinator? In other words, you don't have an approved device, but do you have specs that device has to meet?
Correct. So under the scheduling coordinated meter entity, you are required to follow the local regulatory authority requirements. And in the absence of a local regulatory authority or local regulatory authority, any metering standards, in that case, in the absence of that, you're required to follow ISO requirements, ISO standards, which is not an ISO approved meter, but the accuracy of the device have to meet ISO accuracy standards. So as part of the onboarding process for the scheduling coordinator meter entity, you're required to fill out an SQMD, Settlement Quality Meter Data Template, that gives us all the information about your resource. What device are you using to collect the data and whether it meets the accuracy standard, and how are you collecting the meter data. So it talks about your scheduling coordinator validation, estimation, and editing practices, and what are the audit requirements and everything. So we review all that and make sure that the meter data is collected and the accuracy is maintained through the process of converting that raw data into settlement quality meter data. And if in future, after this resource connects to the grid, and in future if you make any modifications, you're required to notify that to ISO as, again, part of this SQMD template submission. If you add an additional metering or the way you are calculating the meter data, if that changes, those modifications need to be submitted to ISO. And once a year, the scheduling coordinators who submit the settlement quality meter data to ISO, they are required to sign an attestation. It's called SQMD attestation, through which they are telling us that nothing has changed over this year on the way they are collecting the data, or nothing has changed since they submitted the SQMD template to ISO. And if something does, they have to give us an updated documents. And once every other year, the scheduling coordinators are required to do a self-audit on their metadata processing process. And those are the two audit requirements we have in place for the entities that submit the metadata.
Okay. So I work as a developer in solar energy. I also speak with several other developers and battery system integrators and equipment providers. And for the last 2 years, we've been engaged with many of these partners on trying to understand this issue and have been stuck on basically stuck in a place where everyone's been looking for the ISO to approve a meter. But of all the people I've talked to, no one has known of this process by which we can provide a meter that meets a specification rather than being fully certified by itself. Yeah, I think that I would suggest as part of this process, it would be very helpful if you could publish some reference to that guidance that you just described, that our company as well as several others would benefit from that reference, which we had not seen before. Thank you.
Let me repeat your question. You are saying that some of the participants are looking forward for ISO to publish the guidelines for the ISO meters to become a certified ISO meter?
That also, but I was specifically referring to, since you already have a process by which we can have the schedule coordinator metering entity provide that meter, it just needs to meet certain performance specifications. I know that there are lots of equipment manufacturers who are have been looking for a solution to this problem and are not aware that there is a process to provide equipment which meets a performance specification. And you just described that there is already a well-documented process, but I think there is a lack of awareness in the industry that that process exists. And
so,
it probably lots of entities who are following this new process who would appreciate some link to that existing process on metering.
I think I heard two components in your question. The one is metadata processing. How ISO process the metadata, it's the procedure, our validation, estimation, and editing process. It is described in detail in the business practice manual of metering. And most of our scheduling coordinators imitate the same process. They follow the same process. That way they can shadow settlements and verify the settlement statements that ISO publishes. So we publish that on how ISO collects the data, what are the requirements, communication requirements, everything. And scheduling coordinators have a choice to do their VEE similar to ISO, or they can have their own mechanisms. And as part of the SQMD template review, we understand and we provide them some suggestions, or if we have any questions, or if it doesn't meet ISO expectations, we'll have a conversation with them on the VE process. Coming to the standards, again, ISO metering BPM has the standards for requirements, standards to become an ISO certified meter. So the meter manufacturers, when they have a new meter and they look into ISO metering BPM, and if they think that their meter meets ISO standards, they approach us. Like this year, 2 manufacturers have approached us, and we reviewed the specifications of those 2 meters, and we tested them in our lab, and they passed the ISO test, and then we added them to the list of ISO certified meters. So we do have the standards published in the metering BPM. And coming to the LRA, the requirement is that some entities have LRAs, and their LRAs have clear standards on what their metering requirements are. That's what most of our EIM entities, they follow their LRA requirements. And in the absence of the LRA requirements, they fall back to ISO requirements, and they have to meet or exceed the ISO accuracy standards, and we work with our EIM entities to ensure that they meet ISO standards when they don't have LRA. So far, we haven't been approached by any of the DC meters manufacturers, but we are looking forward to certify a DC meter as well to help our participants. As part of this initiative, again, we are encouraging, and we are also reaching out and looking for the meters that meet ISO standards, so we can have a DC meter option available for our customers. Does it answer your question?
It does. I think it would be useful just to add to these slides a link to those references for those parties who have been looking for that information. And
sure. Yeah, definitely.
Thank you.
Do we have any more questions in the queue?
Thanks, Priyanka. I don't believe we have any more questions in the queue, operator, unless you're seeing something in your end.
At this point, we don't have any other questions.
Okay. Just a quick recap on the AC and DC options that we discussed a few minutes ago. Under the separate resource IDs, if either of the generators have a DC metering, they can only participate under the scheduling coordinator meter entity. And the inverter, transformer, and line losses must be calculated and compensated. And the transducer or the DC meter that is used have to meet either the local regulatory authority accuracy standards or ISO accuracy standards. And both the meters can be aggregated, and SQMD can be submitted to ISO under the SCME option. So for the DC connected resource, where the storage unit is charging from the on-site generating unit under a separate resource ID, then again, both the resource components have to be metered. They're required to be metered, and they can participate as an SCME option since it is connected. Since it has a DC meter. Same thing. The inverter, transformer, and line losses must be calculated and compensated, and the resource is required to meet either the LRA standards or the accuracy of ISO accuracy standards. Okay. Do we have any questions at this time?
Thanks, Priyanka. We'll give a few seconds for folks who are in the queue for final questions.
We don't have any questions.
Okay. So the next steps are stakeholders can submit the written comments by September 10th, and they can be submitted to that email address on the slide, initiativecomments@caiso.com. The straw proposal is scheduled to be published on September 26th, and the next stakeholder meeting on the straw proposal is scheduled for October 3rd.
Thanks so much, Priyanka. And as mentioned, we appreciate your participation today, folks. And you can look forward to the recording for today's session to be available the next couple of business days. And once more, thank you, and we look forward to your comments. Please have a great rest of your day.